Greetings. This is the midweek devotional for Wednesday, February 24th, 2021. It's from University United Methodist Church in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I'm Jon Fletcher. I'm a member here at University. And whether you are a regular watcher, attender here at University, or you're just tuning in for the first time, welcome. I'm really glad that you're here. So, one of the people that I follow online every day is a guy named David French. French is a prominent conservative lawyer, a former staff writer at the National Review, and now a senior editor at a Substack newsletter called The Dispatch. He's also an evangelical Christian. Now, those of you who know me can probably guess that I disagree with David French profoundly on a whole lot of issues. Yet I read him often because he's a sharp thinker, he's a good writer, and he's one of the people outside of my bubble that helps me to understand other ways of looking at the world. This last weekend in his newsletter, he related one of the most common questions that he gets from his readers. They say, a person I love is deeply committed to conspiracies. How do I convince them otherwise? For some time now, French has been one of the most outspoken critics from the conservative right about how Christian nationalism, the kind of Christian nationalism that fueled the January 6th insurrectionists, is a negative force, right? He laments how popular some of this movement's beliefs have become in the evangelical Christian community. Things like, the presidential election was a fraud, COVID-19 is a hoax, or vaccination or lies. All of those, he says, run counter to the evidence. Another writer, Varun Gari, calls such narratives bad stories about real fears. That is, they're narratives, stories that people have to explain their fears, to explain the bad things that happen in the world. They feel true to people, and partly because they show you clearly, these stories do, who's good and who's evil. Of course, for those who believe these kind of stories, it's everyone else who's been misled. All evidence to the contrary, that's really just an ever more elaborate fraud perpetrated by villains who are working secretly. Proof against the conspiracy becomes proof of the conspiracy. See, that's just what there's always a they, that's just what they want you to think. Those of you who know me may know that in my professional life, I do research on this kind of thing. I just taught a class at LSU about literacy, information literacy, misinformation, and propaganda. And on a bigger level, I've always been interested in how we humans, Christians particularly, can come to see the world in such radically different ways that we come to regard people who disagree with us as mortal enemies. Perhaps some of you listening to this know people like this in your life. Perhaps it's someone you love, someone whose beliefs have led them into a place that causes you distress. It can be painful to see someone, especially someone you know to be just a wonderful, complex, intelligent, good person, caught up in a story that leads them to embrace what you see as bizarre or counterfactual or even harmful. And those stories aren't just different, but they're divisive. They sort of lead people into believing that if you disagree with me, you're not just wrong, you're part of the evil them that we're fighting against. So, what do we do, asked David French, when our loved ones seem so hostile to being convinced out of their blinkered views? And French points out that first, it's generally healthy to think critically, right? To be open minded, to question evidence. We all have a little conspiratorial thinking in us somewhere. And sometimes there are, in fact, actual confirmed conspiracies. Not every conspiracy is wrong. However, the problem comes, as in the case with many of these conspiracy stories, when we seize upon a conclusion that must be true, and then we warp all evidence into affirming that conclusion. But so by the time someone has become wedded to a particular conclusion, like COVID is fake, the election was stolen, or, the winter storm was the result of Chinese weather machines, by that time that they've wedded themselves to that truth, it's too late, French notes, simply to show them a list of reputable sources that plunk down the supposed proofs. The conspiracy has provided the person a ready-made explanation about why those sources are already wrong. They're resistant to being convinced otherwise. The thing is, French points out, we believe things not primarily because of our rational brains, but because of deeper, more unconscious commitments, particularly the ways that our beliefs situate us in a local network of relationships. French explains, let's suppose that you forward to your Aunt Edna the absolutely perfect fact checked, 900 words, and then her commitment to stop the steal crumbles into ash. Where does that leave her in her friendships? Where does that leave her in her sense of political purpose? Does it leave her disconnected from her friends and her Bible study? Does it impact her relationship with her husband? What about the online community that's embraced her and helped her through the loneliness of the pandemic? Here French invokes the work of social psychologist Jonathan Haidt, who uses the metaphor of an elephant and a rider. Our conscious thinking rational selves, Haidt says, are the riders. The elephant is the 99% of what else goes on in our brains, the unconscious feelings, beliefs, patterns, and reactions that drive us. We like to think that we are the riders in control, that our actions are perfectly rational and justified, but really, Haidt says, research suggests that it's the elephant who's in control. The elephant goes in a direction, and the rider rationalizes that the elephant's direction was where they chose to go all along. To change someone's mind, Jonathan Haidt says, you have to talk to the elephant, not to the rider. That is, you have to become curious about what is this big story that this person believes doing for this person on deep levels? What causes them to buy into this big story? And if you rip away all of the things that that story does for them, what are you replacing it with? Here's David French again. If your role in another person's life is, as you see it, the teller of hard truths, then you are at an immense disadvantage when it comes to contending for a family member's heart with the people who share the same lie but also love them, accept them, and give them a sense of shared purpose. You just make them feel bad. In my experience, this is kind of the hardest and most infuriating thing about persuasion. It's that being right, having the truth, isn't enough. I used to love that show from the early aughts, The West Wing, the one that was set in the White House. It had great actors, snappy writing, had, the sort of lefty values that I like, right? What I really liked about it, though, were it had a propensity for scenes in which some too big for their britches character would get taken down a notch, thanks to some kind of devastating speech delivered perfectly by a Martin Sheen or Allison Janney. The music swells, they give their speech, and the villain is just like sputtering and deflated, put in their place. It's the perfect sort of scene of comeuppance, a total rhetorical victory. But of course, it's a fantasy. In real life, we rarely go silent just because someone fires off a speech at us. And I have never seen anyone get yelled at or thoroughly embarrassed and then turn around and say, you know what, you are absolutely right. Thank you for that correction. I don't react that way when someone yells at me or plunks down my basic beliefs. Sure, I may be able to silence someone that I might have some kind of power over, but can I convince them? Not through a high-minded monologue, not even with a devastatingly effective argument. Such scenes remind me of those parts in the Psalms, where the speaker imagines their enemies being defeated, thrown into disarray. They ask God to do it for them. God defeat them, show them the truth, show them how wrong they were, and how often we invoke God to come in and simply start dishing out truth. Our truth, of course, the truth that defeat our enemies, right? You'll do that for us, won't you, God? Come in and fix those broken, hurtful people in our lives. But when God does come in, especially right now, in the season of Lent, for me at least, it's often to remind me of my own brokenness, the times where I have been a hurtful person to other people. And God doesn't do this merely for kicks or some divine guilt trip to make me feel crummy. It's a message. It's a message, a reminder that part of my faith is there but for the grace of God go I. There but for the grace of God go I. I grew up in rural Oklahoma in a conservative denomination. I can imagine myself having become an adult in a very different kind of community had my life been just a little bit different. If my parents hadn't been politically moderate, if my sister hadn't been so rigorously ethical, frankly, if I hadn't been gay, if I hadn't met my partner who isn't a Christian, if I hadn't met a lot of other people who are outside of the bubble that I otherwise would have had, if it hadn't been for the grace of God bringing these other people into my life, course correcting me in gentle ways, then I might as well just now be, maybe I would have been one of those conspiracy theorists. I've grown enough to view and see and regret and repent of a lot of beliefs and habits and actions from my younger days. And I did that not through someone coming along and shattering my beliefs with a West Wing takedown. I did it because these other people, usually other Christians, but not only other Christians, they showed me grace and patience. They shared themselves in ways that let me see how some of the things I did or said hurt them or other people. They believed that I could be better than I was, and they guided me towards that better version of myself. I am still imperfect. God still guides me to be better through a multitude of course corrections. And for that reason, French advises that we launch our persuasive overtures from a place of humility. There, but for the grace of God, go I. Now, let me pause here to say that none of this means that you should just stand for abuse or just withstand when someone is, spouting hate speech or lies. There is a time for patient and humble grace, and there is a time for setting boundaries and self-care. It is certainly not a victim's job to be the patient, graceful, forgiving one for their abuser. It is not anyone's job to be conspiracy whisperer all the time. That said, there may be some people in your life that you are actually in a good position to be loving and patient with. And I do think that there's a place that we Christians have sometimes, for some situations at least, to be a gentle persuader. Because here's the thing, I think a healthy faith offers its own big story, but it's a better big story. I think consider the kind of deep or unconscious things that bad conspiracy stories provide for people. A sense of purpose, a network of support, a vision of something grander than themselves, a means of making sense of the difficulties that life throws at you. We Christians, we Methodists, we have a story that does all those things. We celebrate its cycle every year. It's a story of imperfect people trying to become better, embracing grace rather than retribution. And I would say that that's important. There's two features that sort of mark our kind of story as different from the sort of bad conspiracy tales. First would be humility, a deep awareness of there, but for the grace of God go I. And there's grace, a commitment to giving people time and space to be more than what they have been. Those features drive us, but they also provide a check for us. They also stop us in our tracks sometimes, that just when I think that I have the absolute truth and I am certain and I am going, then suddenly someone comes along and shows me that God is bigger than how I thought God was. Joe Klein, who's writing for Time, back in 2003, and this is a lead up to the invasion of Iraq, and he was writing about the faith of George W. Bush, and he concludes, quote, "His faith does not discomfort Bush enough. It does not impel him to have second thoughts, to explore other intellectual possibilities, or question the possible consequences of his actions. It does not give him pause or force him to reflect. It is a source of comfort and strength, but not of wisdom. I think about that a lot. I think the reality of the bad, big stories that are out there that are so compelling to people, it reminds us of a constant danger for our own Christian story. How close our Christian story always is to becoming that kind of cast in stone certainty that, explains absolutely everything and neatly divides the world into good guys and bad guys. At that point, religion becomes a kind of conspiratorial truth, or at least something that feels to us like truth, except it's shorn of humility and grace. Those things we can't lose and still have our faith, I would say. Remember, Paul says three things remain. After you take away everything else, three things remain. And none of those things is necessarily the truth. None of those things is being right. The three things are faith, hope, and love. Those are the features of our story. Find ways to live into that story of faith, hope, and love. Find ways to share that story with humility and grace, and then find ways to listen for it being shared anew with you. Find ways for that story coming from unexpected sources to course correct, to connect you, and to make your part in our grand Christian story a bit better. Grace and peace to you.